Can you tell me when you realized after you started the hub that you needed to hire somebody?
Yeah, when you first start a company, it is you. And that all narcissism aside, that's a really cool thing. Like we experience ourselves in our own minds and in our friendships and so on, maybe. But when you actually create something, and it could be a piece of pottery or um, a short film or really anything, but you create something like a company, and it's out in the world, and a lot of people start reacting to it, and you can sort of objectively see this thing that is outside, external to you, but is really just fueled by your life force. And you start to see yourself, like you're like, oh yeah, like those are things I'm really good at. Like it's so cool that the company's also good at those things. And then you're like, oh my God, the company sucks in these regards. Like we're getting killed. Like my finances are a joke. And every time I talk to an investor, they poke holes in how I've laid out my financial model, or we've made a lot of tenuous legal decisions, or I'm really creative, but operationally we're just really struggling to be efficient, or any number of things. And you sort of realize where your holes are, where your blind sides are. So I think that was sort of my first, like, okay, I've got to hire against my weaknesses, and find people to help me at things that I am less good at. Or in the case of me building software, hire people for things that I simply cannot do at all. It's not that I'm bad at it. I just literally don't know how to write a line of code, and we need to write many lines of code.
What position did your first employee fill? And can you tell me about hiring them?
My first employees were, we had no money. So I paid them 250 bucks a week. I didn't pay myself. They were 19 years old, and they were sort of domain experts. They were the first Instagram photographers I knew. And so the main role they played was really teaching me about the space, teaching me about the world that I was about to enter, getting their friends interested in building our first sort of layer of the community of photographers that has now grown to 40,000. And then also business operations, and some of them were okay at that and others less so. But I think the first couple hires were domain expertise. So if you're going to go into cold brew, it probably helps to have someone that knows a little bit about coffee. If you're going to go into fashion, probably helps you have someone that knows about fashion. So if you as the founder don't have immense expertise, and again, I built a marketplace, so I knew a lot about the brand side and the sort of agency world, but I didn't know a lot about the young creator world. And my first couple people were all in here. Um, then I hired a designer. I was just friends with her. She made our first logo, but pretty quickly thereafter, it was technical people that were able to build the crossbeam between the brands and the creators.
And what set aside the people who you wanted to stick with and who really thrived in this environment from everybody else?
I think a huge mistake I made, and I don't know how common this is, but when you first start a company, some people I witnessed being very cocky. This is going to be the next big thing. I might have felt that way for a second, but very quickly felt embarrassed. I had this vision in my mind of what it could become, but we were so far from that. And just as with anything in life, there are people that get it pretty quickly. And then there are people like, for example, the technical people I hired, the developers, who don't know a thing about brands or agencies and don't know a thing about photography. And so the fact that we were creating a marketplace for those two types of people, they know nothing of this. And so the potential brilliance of the idea was completely lost on them. And so instead of trying to sell them and convince them, which I think is quite important, I just threw money at it. I'd raised some money from friends and family about a year in, and I just paid anyone I hired market rate, or actually in certain cases, like my second developer that I hired, we needed a front end specialist very quickly. And he'd worked the same job for 10 years. And I needed him to come quickly. So I said I'd match his salary plus 25%, leave tomorrow. And he did, but developers make a lot. So that was a $30,000 bump I just gave him, or maybe a little more. Um, just to make him move, because I didn't have the time or the patience to like really try to get him to see the brilliance of this vision and buy in emotionally. So a big mistake I made was hiring with cash and having myself and maybe one or two others that were ride or die. We believe in this idea to the ends of the earth. And then people that were making above market rate to be mercenaries. And that created a sort of caste system that was unhealthy. And really only now, just 4.5 years in, am I sort of, everyone at the company, I would say, is equally emotionally bought in and equally sees the vision, which is partially because I've gotten rid of people that didn't, and partially because the company has matured to the point where it's not just a vague idea, it's actually occupying physical space in the real world. So even someone with a less good imagination or less sophisticated understanding of the space can appreciate the vision, I think, a little bit easier than they would have 4 years ago, say.
Also, when you are trying to hire somebody, in addition to somebody who really gets the vision, what kind of qualities in the person do you tend to be drawn towards?
Yeah, I remarked to you, Ella, a month or two ago that I had 4 employees, and I hadn't realized this until we were talking, but that I was the only one that had gone to college of the 5 of us. And I thought that was kind of interesting because, I went to Princeton, and there's sort of an elitist, to buy into Princeton and to pay the obnoxiously high tuition and so on, you sort of buy into this notion that going to a top 10 school or a top 20 school means you're a cut above the rest. Like that whether or not you're obnoxiously consciously thinking about that, I think it sort of permeates your skull. So I've had 30 or 40 employees over time, and I've definitely sought out or given preferential treatment to people that went to really impressive schools or worked at really impressive other jobs prior. Like, ooh, this person worked at Amazon or something. And there's almost no correlation in entrepreneurship between, in fact, sometimes there's a negative correlation that by going to a big name school or working at a big name company, you think you're God's gift. And there's a certain entitlement and hesitation to, so I would say the common thread of people that I am so glad I hired, would hire again, and or are still at the company is a deep hunger. And sometimes that comes from an unhealthy place. It's a chip on a shoulder. They have something to prove to themselves, to the world, to someone. It might be because of their race or gender and being held back, and they want to prove that they're good enough or better. It might be because their last boss told them that they sucked at their job. It might be because a couple of my employees, myself included, came from money and privilege and wanted to show that we can work hard and like we're not entitled jerks. So people that have something like that, where they're like, they have a thirst, they have a need, or sometimes it comes from a healthy place, which is just deep passion, a deep curiosity, a deep desire to better oneself. That hunger is something that is a non-negotiable for me. And I don't really let anyone get to this. I'll hire people, but they don't get into the core. They don't get into the center of the company, the operation room, unless they have that trait.
I'm curious, was there a moment at which you realized that this hunger was really the driving force, and what changed when you really started to tap into that?
I think just examples on both sides, hiring a peer from Princeton who had a whole bunch of other problems, but who just was a disaster as an employee. Hiring a young woman who went to a very good school and then immediately went to a very good graduate program. And then I hired her upon graduating from that. So she'd never worked a job, but she was 26 and had gone to the best schools. And she took 10 or 15% off the plate of one of my employees that had never gone to school. And she just buckled under the pressure of a fraction of what this other person had been dealing with. And it was just sort of like, wow, like, you have to be a certain level of intelligence to get into these schools, but there's so much more than intelligence that it takes to, it's really sustaining an effort and seeing something through and bringing intensity again and again and being able to deal with failure and disappointment, uncertainty. I have a friend I'm meeting with right after this. He's one of my smartest friends from Princeton, like brilliant, almost a genius, but incapable of any uncertainty. He's helping me with a little project, moonlighting. And he's emailed me like 4 times wanting to prepare and more information and more detail. And he just needs more structure than a startup can afford him. He's not comfortable just sort of figuring things out and sort of crudely putting the puzzle together. He's used to being held to a very high perfectionist standard from college and his current job. And so if you're not willing to sort of deal with imperfection and toil through things and deal with failure along the way, if you need everything to be just so, your brain sort of explodes like after months and months of entrepreneurship. So perseverance, grit, determination, hunger, passion, much more than intelligence or charm or eloquence or sometimes even experience.
A big thing actually driving a lot of today's workplace is that a lot of employees feel like their managers or their companies just aren't investing in them to just level up and be better. So, if you had any advice to somebody who wanted to just be either a better worker, employee, or just person in their career, what would that advice be?
I'm happy to answer the question. I actually strongly disagree with the premise. I think it's the opposite. And it sounds like I'm bitter. I'm not really that bitter about it. It's just sort of an observation. And by the way, I'm facilitating this. The future of work is a world in which the institutions lose power and the individual gains it. So one of my top employees, she worked for me for 3 years, and I gave her raise after raise after raise after raise, always more than the company could afford to keep her because she was so talented. And then she went out on her own, and we kind of had a falling out for a bit because I felt that was a disloyal action. But she didn't need me. And she went out on her own and has many, many clients and an amazing portfolio and makes twice as much than I or really any other company could afford to pay her as a freelancer. And we now work together all the time on probably 2 projects a month, where I have client work and I bring it to her. But the individual doesn't need, I see this with designers, I see this with developers, I see it with animators, photographers, and increasingly you'll see it with almost anyone, where if you have a skill, you can find the demand in the world that needs that skill, and you don't need a big institution to be the middleman. You can just go right to the demand and do it on a fractional basis. And that's the whole thesis behind the future of work, where we are all very unique supply and there's a very unique demand set out there, and we will be matched very eloquently. We talk about Spotify a lot on this little podcast, and the fact that Spotify can recommend music or keep playing music that's tonally exactly what you want. It's sort of the same thing. Imagine building a business and LinkedIn intuiting, oh, you have a lot of really creative people. Maybe you want someone who's more of a structured thinker now, or maybe you want someone who, has certain attributes. It isn't just that they went to a good school or worked at a good company, but they're a very specific type of person, a very specific type of puzzle piece. That's where the job market's heading. So I would argue that it's not that individuals don't get mentorship or grow within an institution, it's that they leave. The average 28-year-olds had 5 jobs. The average 28-year-old 2 decades ago had 1 or 2.
So then to pivot it, what would your advice be to somebody who is entering this freelance world or is just whatever their case may be or whatever their employment status, be it traditional or not traditional, if they're trying to level up as an employee or as a contractor, what would your advice be?
Couple things. I mean, I think you're building a brand, right? So having a place, like tightly defining yourself. what is it that you do? What is the value that you bring? And the tighter, the better in most cases, as opposed to just saying like, so my Princeton diploma says that like, James is pretty smart. It's really like all it says. Or maybe if you add it to your major, it's like James is pretty smart with respect to this thing. If you have a website that says, I create the designs for e-commerce websites for food businesses, like I see websites like that. And now you have a very specific, you are a specific puzzle piece, and you give the market the opportunity to need that exact. There will be people that are like, I'm building a website for a food and beverage product, and this is a designer that does exactly that. So you see this with developers, like they make Shopify websites, or they're really good at WordPress, or they just, or they're React specialists, like they do one thing and then the market needs that and they can market themselves. So I'd say like, what is your thing? What is your angle? What is your elevator pitch? And how can you put that very tightly on a website, tightly in the email pitches that you send out? Like when you sell yourself, don't just sell yourself as a vaguely intelligent person that's done a lot of things. Sharpen the pitch. And then a network, who are people to whom you can bring business and that will bring business to you. And also having a crew, if you're a designer, you need to know a couple of developers, a couple of animators, a couple of photographers, because clients will always they always want a lot of problems solved. Like clients don't think I need a designer, because then they'd also have to think I need a developer, I need an animate. Like what they think is I need a website. And if you as the designer can say, yeah, I can do the design, my friend Terry can do this, my friend Stephanie can do that. If you have sort of a crew, you make the decision a lot easier for the person hiring you, because you can solve a problem from tip to tail. You bring your expertise and then bring the other people to the party that can complete the picture.